Stories about America to read aloud. Number 16, High Country. The young beaver was sitting beside a pond in the beautiful high country of Colorado, but he wished that he were someplace else. Nearby, his father was busy cutting down young aspen trees so the family would have food when winter came. With his strong teeth, Father Beaver gnawed through the trees, and when they fell, he pushed and dragged them into the pond. There they were stored under the water. In winter, when everything above ground was frozen, the beavers would eat the tender bark that covered the trees. Beavers don't get cold, even in icy wet water, for they are covered with thick brown fur. "What's the matter, son?" asked Father Beaver, stopping to rest for a moment. "You're looking gloomy for such a bright, sunshiny day." "I don't like it around here," said the little fellow. "I wish we could move." Father Beaver clicked his long teeth disapprovingly. "That sounds foolish," he said. "There's no other place as fine as the high country. We've got mountains and rivers and lots of aspen trees to nibble on, and this beautiful, cool pond to live in. What more could a beaver want?" "I don't like the people around here," said Little Bevo. "Now that is foolish," his father declared. "You'll never find nicer people anywhere than Mr. Elk and Mrs. Antelope. Of course, Mr. Grizzly Bear isn't very sociable when he sleeps all winter in a cave, but the Rocky Mountain sheep come down to the valley when winter starts, so we still have plenty of company." "I don't like any of them," said Little Bevo firmly. "They call me Paddle-tail and say I'm funny-looking." He twisted his neck around so that he could look at his long, broad tail. It did look like a paddle. "Well, now," said Father Beaver, "most people have something different about them. Look at Mr. Raccoon, always wearing that silly black mask, as if he thinks every night is Halloween. And poor Mrs. Turtle can't even go for a walk without carrying her whole house on her back. She must get very tired of housekeeping. Yes," continued Father Beaver, "there are some very odd people in the world. Why, down on the highway you've seen the circus posters of all the circus animals. I remember one who had a horn on the end of his nose, Mr. Rhino something. Even his name was odd." Murmured Little Bevo thoughtfully. Suddenly he grinned and recited a poem he had just made up. "A giraffe's neck is yards too long. Bears sleep the winter through. A camel's lunch is in his hump, and cows have a cud to chew." "That's quite clever," said Father Beaver admiringly. "Now go play while I finish my work." He didn't notice that Little Bevo suddenly looked gloomy again. "Yes," said Father Beaver, "you're quite clever. When you're older, I'll teach you how to build dams." Now, beavers are nature's great engineers. They always know just how to build and protect their strange homes, called lodges, that are in the water. Beside a stream, they gnaw down small trees and stack them in cone-shaped mounds. Then they plaster the mounds with mud and line the inside living quarters with grass. Downstream, they build a dam of logs and branches and mud. The dam causes the water to back up around the lodges so that every beaver home is guarded by several feet of water. To get into his house, a beaver dives down beside it and crawls through a long, dark tunnel. Then he comes up into his grass-lined living room, where he has an air space. Beavers are such good engineers that they never raise the water in their pond high enough to flood the room inside the lodge. "Yes," said Father Beaver to his little son, "you'll be very good at building dams, a clever boy like you. Now go play with your friends while I gnaw some wood." Little Bevo didn't move. Instead, he said, "I don't want to. I'm tired of being a hat." "A hat?" Father Beaver stared in surprise. "What are you talking about?" Little Bevo snuffed his nose as if he were getting ready to cry. "Everybody, Mr. Elk and Mrs. Antelope and even old Grandpa Sheep, say that that's what men used to make out of beavers, fur hats. So the other kids put me on their heads and play I'm a hat. Someday," said Little Bevo darkly, "I'll fall off and get hurt." Father Beaver looked angry. "I'm surprised at our friends. They're just jealous. Of course, beaver fur was once used for men's hats. That's why this whole western part of the country was first traveled and explored. Men far away, even in England, wanted beaver hats, and the finest beaver fur, mind you, the finest beaver fur came from right here in the high country. It did? Asked little Bevo. He bent his tail under him and sat up as if he were on a springboard. It did, said Father Beaver. So fur trappers, men like Kit Carson and Jim Bridger, came here to trap beaver, and they stayed to explore the country and guide the wagon trains west. Why, this would have been wild country for a lot longer time if it hadn't been for us beavers. We're the ones who should get credit for civilizing the West. Little Bevo began to look proud. I'll tell people, he said. You do that, said his father, and tell them I'm surprised at them. Mr. Elk knows very well that men wore his teeth as charms on their watch chains, and Grandpa Sheep's folks are hunted by men who want to hang their horns on the wall. And Mrs. Antelope, well, the Indians used to make tents out of antelope hide. I'm sure I'd rather be a stylish fur hat than a tent flapping in the wind. Other people are awfully queer, strange, aren't they? Said little Bevo. He thought for a moment, and then he grinned and recited a poem he had just made up. Leopards have spots like polka dots, and cats have a funny purr. A porcupine is covered with quills. He looks like a cockleburr. Very clever, said Father Beaver. I don't know how you think of such clever things. Well, I must get back to work on or your mother will say I'm not bringing home enough trees. Why don't you go invite some of your friends over for a visit? But little Bevo's grin faded, and he began to look gloomier than ever. They won't come, he said. They can't get into our house, and if they could, they'd get all wet. I wish, said little Bevo sadly, that we lived on top of the ground like other people. Father Beaver had started to gnaw a good-sized aspen, and now he stopped and came back to the pond's edge. He looked annoyed. He said, Don't ever say that again. Don't you know that beavers are the greatest natural engineers in the world? Men learn from us. Why, not long ago, a great atomic plant in Canada had to have beavers repair a leaky dam. Our people could do what men couldn't. We found the leaks and plugged them. Men need us to live in ponds and build dams and teach them. Father Beaver took a deep breath. Then he said sternly, My son, next to the buffalo, beavers were probably the most important wild animal in American history. And you're a beaver. Now never let me hear you complain again. Then Father Beaver waddled off to work. Little Bevo stood quietly beside the pond, thinking of all that his father had told him. He began to feel wonderful. And my, wasn't it a bright, sunshiny day? And wasn't the high country a fine place to live? Suddenly he was sorry for all the animals who lived in other places, and couldn't teach men to build dams, and looked so odd and weren't beavers. He felt so good he decided to go swimming. But first he grinned and recited another poem he had just made up. A bat has fingers on his wings, an elephant drinks with his nose, and horses have hoofs instead of feet, so they can't wiggle their toes. No, no, lucky little Bevo hummed to himself as he poised for a dive into the clear water of his shining pond. Horses can't wiggle their toes. Splash!